This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans.
Tamara Pitzke is a whistleblower from Washington State whose story was published by the Free Press last week. She has a master's in social work from the University of Washington and has worked with older adults, pregnant and postpartum women, the chronically mentally ill, those in inpatient centers, and she spent the last 6 years doing outpatient community mental health. She told us that she's never sought out to be a whistleblower, but she believes wholeheartedly in having a voice when something is wrong, even when it seems like you're standing alone. She will always advocate in the best interest of her clients, not because they're her clients, but because they're people and people are worth fighting for. And here's our conversation with Tamara. Welcome back to Transparency, everyone. I'm Aaron Kimberly here with my co-host, as always, Aaron Terrell. And today we have Tamara Pietzke here with us, who recently told her story through the Free Press article about what happened, Tamara, with your career and the clinic that we were working in. So I'd like to just start from the beginning and walk through that story of what you were seeing, like what happened in your practice, what you were seeing clinically, and why you became concerned.
Yeah, sure. So I'd been with Multicare for 6 years. I'd worked with gender dysphoric youth in the past, but there wasn't like a specific protocol that we were supposed to follow. We basically just did therapy with them like with anybody else. Um, Last March, I had a client come in, a 16-year-old, and say that they identified it as a wounded male dog. And that was when I was like, like I want people to feel safe talking to me about who they are and how they feel like they identify. But is there at any point that we start to think like, okay, this person has been so traumatized by their life that they can't even identify as human anymore? Like that seems like a mental health concern. And so I asked my colleagues about that. And they basically said no, that if it's not causing an issue for them, if the client's not reporting that their identity as a wounded male dog is a problem for them, then it's not a problem for us, that it's not something that we need to work on them, work with on, work, work with them on. And so I kind of just like, that didn't sit well with me, but we kind of just moved past that. And then early September, we were told there was going to be a mandatory gender affirming care training. And I just felt like that was I didn't have a lot of information about gender affirming care or just like what exactly that meant. But I had a sense that that was not going to be, that the meeting was going to be troublesome for me morally, that I wasn't going to be able to say, yeah, I agree with what standards are being set in place. So I spent the few days leading up to the meeting, like doing tons of research online, trying to figure out what are the pros for gender affirming care, what are the cons for gender affirming care, and where do I sit with this? And am I understanding correctly what gender affirming care is? And then I went to the meeting and I asked some questions and I said, you know, why are we running full steam ahead with this if countries in Europe are pulling back? I just asked some basic questions and I tried to ask it in a way that wouldn't make anyone feel challenged or defensive. But I was met with a lot of hostility. The speaker was very dismissive. The chat box with my colleagues blew up saying like, you're doing harm to clients. Why would you bring politics into this? I couldn't even work that day because I was so like taken aback by how cruelly people talked to me. So after the meeting, I was so distraught. And following the meeting, I kept asking questions. So my boss initially was like, that was not the correct forum to ask those questions, which again didn't sit well with me because what would be the correct forum? Like if I have the opportunity to talk to 122 of my colleagues and be like, hey, there might be another side of this story here, like there might be information that you're not being told, then I absolutely want to alert people to that, versus having behind the scenes conversations where I just continue to be silenced. But I went that route. And so I ended up emailing the speaker of the presentation. I asked my boss some questions and again, was basically told, you don't know what you're talking about and you need to examine your biases. And then a couple months later, I had a client, a 13-year-old. Her father, um, his father, I'm sorry, I don't know the right way to phrase how to say it, but asked to start for the client to start a letter to begin testosterone. And I was like, I can't do that. Like they had an extensive trauma history. They had a diagnosis of autism. So in our interactions, I had only met with them 3 times, but like they would just scroll through their phone and show me like really graphic images and videos, like anime style videos. And they would just like rock back and forth. And I was really unable to like even engage with them or get a lot of like in-depth conversation out of them. Um, and I was like, this does not seem like a candidate for testosterone, you know? And so I asked again the speaker of the presentation and my boss, and I said, I don't feel comfortable writing a letter for this child. And they told me that there's no reason why a person's trauma history or mental health diagnoses or autism diagnosis would disqualify them for testosterone or any other hormone therapy. So after that, I was reported to risk management. And initially I thought, okay, finally, risk management, and I can talk this through. We can look at the client's chart. We can figure out, okay, so yeah, here's the concerns. Here's why WPATH backs me up in this, saying that we should just, hold off for a little bit. But instead, it was determined that I was the risk to the client and they took them from me. So yeah, and I knew at that point I can't keep working for a company that doesn't listen to my concerns. At one point, I sent my boss an article shortly after the meeting, and I said it just was like a short article that really summarized why I felt the need to speak up at the meeting. Um, and she said she didn't have time to read it, and that it makes me want to cry because I feel like if there's any chance that I'm right here, if there's any chance that we're hurting children, make the time to look at the article. Like, there's not an excuse not to. It just breaks my heart that people are so quick to go along with whatever they're hearing and not do any of their own research.
Did
What
you get
else
the
did you
sense?
determine about that patient, about like, or that client? I mean, had there been a long-standing history of gender nonconformity and gender dysphoria, or had that kind of
Mm-mm.
emerged more recently?
Yeah, with both of the clients I've mentioned so far, the 13-year-old and the 16-year-old, it was something the 16-year old said that it was something that they started reading about online during COVID and that they were like, oh, that sounds like me. And then the 13-year-old, they're it was I think around when they were like 11 that they started saying that they weren't um their the gender that they were assigned at birth. And so when I asked them about that though, like when I said, I see that you have an upcoming gender clinic appointment here, they didn't even know about it. They're like they never told me that they felt like they were the opposite gender. So yeah, it's kind of confusing as to how that um was determined.
It sounds like that younger one had an incredibly traumatic background of
Very,
severe
very
abuse and
traumatic.
neglect.
Yes. Yeah. They mom tried to kill their older sister while they watched, like just a lot of sexual trauma. It was an incredibly traumatic upbringing. They said that the only movies in their house when they were growing up were porn and horror. So that's what they were exposed to as a young child. Um, it was, yeah, a very, very sad story.
And as I understand, the child is being raised by like the father is not the biological father,
No,
correct? And but that wasn't it wasn't the abusive one, so that's good. But I'm
right. Yes.
wondering if the push for testosterone is maybe like a protective. I run into this a lot of like you know uh, young people with a history of abuse seeking young females with a history of abuse seeking testosterone treatment because it's a protective measure from further assault. And I could understand a protective father perhaps wanting to do this, like thinking of the same. I'm just trying to justify what he was thinking and why he thought testosterone was a good call in this very, very troubled child, but yeah, beside the point. I'll let you tell the story.
Yeah, no. So, two of the people that I mentioned in the article said that they also had gender dysphoric siblings. So then that makes me wonder, like, what is going on there in the family system? Because my understanding is that the likelihood of two siblings both having gender dysphoria is pretty rare, you know? So I don't know if it was protective. I don't know. I don't know, you know?
Sounds like you weren't really given the opportunity to explore any of that.
Absolutely not. No, that multi-care made it very clear that we are not allowed to ask any of those kind of questions. I would never, ever try to talk somebody out of their identity. I just want to be able to work. I want kids to get to be to get I want kids to get to be kids. I want them to figure out who they are, and I see it as an honor to get to walk through that process with them. I would never say, no, you're not that thing, you know? But let's not make lifelong body altering decisions that their brains aren't even fully developed enough to understand the gravity of, you know? Especially if there's like a social element, if they're autistic and they feel like they don't feel comfortable in their body, if they're a teenager and they feel like they're not comfortable in their body. Well, those seem like other reasons to like, okay, well, what else is going on here? Because I think it's very common for autistic people or even teenagers to be like, I don't know why I don't feel like I fit in. And so then they start looking for answers to that. And maybe they settle on something that feels true to them that they will decide differently about down the road, you know?
Did you have a chance to talk to any of the parents?
With a 16-year-old, the mom was in every session. So yes. Not with anybody else. The 13-year-old, I talked with dad briefly because I was calling to make another appointment for them, and that's when the letter of testosterone came up, or the letter to support testosterone.
So it sounds like parents in both cases were on board with starting testosterone.
Yeah, with the 16-year-old, the only reason that they didn't start testosterone was because dad wouldn't allow it.
But it sounds like
Yeah,
they went
but
from identifying as a boy, like the original. They originally decided that they were what, a trans boy, and they were seeking transition, but then um, there was like roadblocks in the way because of the father not being on board with a transition, and then later on down the road, they came to the 16-year-old came to the conclusion that she was actually a wounded dog and not a wounded male dog and not a trans boy. Um,
that was just like a two-session blip, like, and then that never came up again. So I'm not sure. Yeah, but they did say that they felt like they were um male, and then the wounded male dog piece, and then they went back to being, identifying as male.
okay.
Mhm.
It's always hard to tell, like from the surface of things, whether someone kind of means that metaphorically or literally. And it sounds like you weren't really given an opportunity to explore what that meant to the client and what it meant for them and how that developed.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that they meant it literally because they were saying that they felt like they didn't have all the appendages that they should have and they wanted to start wearing ears and a tail and stuff. Um, but I felt like I had to tread very lightly. I didn't want to ask anything that was going to make them feel like, um, I just didn't know. I didn't want to be offensive or suggest that their feelings weren't valid, but I also felt like I'm not doing my job as a therapist if we don't explore this.
I'm thinking about what you're saying in the context of like Canadian therapy, conversion therapy law. We have federal law as well as regional and provincial laws, but our federal law is worded in such a way it says that it would be a criminal offense to try to shift anyone's gender identity into a cisgender identity. So it's very, very vague. And I mean, this has never, of course, been tested in court, but if your client had a gender identity as a wounded male dog, it would be considered conversion therapy to try to change that,
Yeah, my
right?
understanding is, yeah, that's my understanding is that I could have gotten in trouble if I tried to like be like to work through that with them at all, you know?
And of course, therapy, as you know, I mean, is never about coercing or forcing change on a
No,
person,
absolutely not.
but you hope, like, if someone obviously has a maladaptive self-conception, that, I mean, the hope of therapy is change, right? I mean, that's why people come to therapy is I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm whatever, right? I have an eating disorder, and they're looking for change, and through self-exploration, we lead them through a process of self-exploration so that they can start to activate some change in their lives. So in the case of someone who has and this is why these very poorly worded conversion therapy laws are so frightening, because I don't think they were really thinking, well, a person could have a gender identity as a cat or a dog or a chair, right? And these are maladaptive identities, especially if they're wanting any surgical medical interventions to
Yeah,
align their bodies with these identities. So it's frightening that we can't ever really explore more deeply what these identities mean for a person.
absolutely. It is very scary to me. You know, I want my clients to live very fulfilled lives where they feel good about themselves. And I don't have an end goal as to what that looks like for each individual person. I just want to be able to like help guide them in that process of figuring out, okay, what does that look like for you? And if something is the result of trauma, like I don't want to feel like we have to tiptoe around that and not address it. Like there's all these like horrible things that happen to that 13-year-old, and there's no way for me to work through that with them without it potentially coming off as me trying to talk them out of their gender. Like that doesn't, it's just so, I don't understand how
Mm-hmm.
an employer can mandate that their clinicians stop doing therapy basically and just sign off on anything that comes across their desk as like, um, hormone replacement therapy or something else.
Especially when I mean, it would be one thing for the client to identify as a dog. I mean, that happens. Like we were hearing that from kids quite a bit, but the fact that they're saying it's a wounded
Yeah,
male dog, right? I mean, they're expressing distress. They're expressing
absolutely.
pain.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Like I want to know why you feel so traumatized by life that you can't even be human anymore, that you feel like a wounded male dog. Like that's not where I want you to live the rest of your life in that mindset. Like that, you deserve better than that.
What was
So
the process of working with these clients prior to that training? Because you said that you had plenty of patients with depression, anxiety, including gender dysphoric patients. Um, what were those presentations like prior to this whole training and you getting on the uh, on the wrong side of the clinic?
yeah. I nothing really jumps out at me because I feel like I saw so many people and I just treated them the way I would treat anybody coming in with like depression, anxiety. Like, let's just talk about the things going on in your life, you know? Like, I didn't feel like I had to rush to diagnose them with anything or rush to like uh send them to a gender care clinic. Like that was not there was not this pressure on that. It was just let's talk about the things that are causing you distress and where you can find um just fullness of life and how can I help guide you in this process of just figuring out who you are and what you want out of life. So yeah, I felt like I could just do therapy with them without potentially doing something wrong according to my employer.
So your employer was saying, it sounds like the employer was saying two things. One is that you're not allowed to explore those things more deeply with the client, and B, you're not allowed to say no to writing a letter for the hormone start. Am I reading that correctly? That
Yeah. Yeah. So when I aired my concerns about that, the speaker at the training said, that she wanted to make it very clear that this was best practice and multi-care would tolerate nothing less. That um, people know who they are, that we don't ask questions about their gender identity or any of the factors that might be influencing that, and that if somebody wants to start testosterone or anything else, that we sign off on that. Otherwise, we are not providing best care and we are not keeping kids from killing themselves and we are harming them essentially.
one of the things that I've noticed in terms of a shift in care over the years, because there used to be a lot more mental health oversight in gender medicine like 20 years ago. And it seems like in particular, I mean, there are a lot of different clinicians being elbowed out of the care, but mental health clinicians in particular are being completely eliminated from the care as if it's
Mhm.
somehow irrelevant
Yeah.
and a barrier to care. And I think mental health clinicians are the ones that are catching these things, right? That it's not, it goes it defies everything that we learn as mental health clinicians about what good care is. And we're being told to just sort of put all of our clinical knowledge in the wastebasket at this point, right? And when we feel these things, when we feel a client expressing distress, or I
Yeah,
mean,
it's really sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt
no,
you.
no, just I was just going to ask, like, how does that feel for you to feel as though you have concerns? And when I know for myself, when I meet with people, you develop instincts for clients, you develop sort of a spidey sense for things that might be going on for a client. And I can only imagine what it must have felt like for you to feel that spidey sense, right? That there's something deeper going on here, and being told that you have to just shut off that instinct as a clinician. How did that feel for you?
Yeah, it was I can't even explain the like process of trying to figure out, am I crazy? Like people are saying that I'm transphobic. I just don't even know how to like process the fact that, because I feel like my colleagues, they genuinely want to do good work and they still turned on me. They still acted like I was the problem, that my concerns weren't valid. So, after the training, I only had four people reach out to me and be like, I'm so glad you said something. I understand. And I was quickly alienated from everybody else that I work with. So, yes, um, I think that we therapists are the ones that are like, wait, why is my role here just to sign off on a letter for them to start whatever, hormone therapy or surgery or whatever? Why is that my only role? Like that doesn't sit well with me. But I think a lot of clinicians have been sort of indoctrinated with the mindset that like if you don't do this, then you're not being a good clinician. And I think that they've bought into that the best thing they can do is allow a child to be exactly who they think they are at 13.
Well, this is how people are able to say, yes, we follow the WPATH standards of care because we did send the client to a mental health clinician who signed a letter. But
Sure.
it's such a meaningless letter, right? If like, what
It
is the point of having any mental health input or oversight if you're not actually allowed to use your best clinical judgment?
Sure. And when I said I don't feel comfortable writing it, they just gave the client to another clinician who would. Like it doesn't, it's just a hoop to jump through that means nothing, you know? And I lost my train of thought.
Which I really don't think those what the standards of care are advocating for, right? When they say these kids should be assessed, we should,
Yes.
and they say, especially if things like autism, then bring in autism specialists, right? And really explore these things with the client. That is what they're endorsing for children and youth in those chapters. And you're right. It's a lot of places are just turning that into just a kind of a meaningless checkbox and not really following the standards at all. But they get to say that they are
Mhm. Yeah,
because they have people sign these letters.
sure. And even the gender care clinic notes, I feel like when I was concerned that they weren't being thorough in their assessment of these kids, for instance, my 13-year-old who really couldn't even have a conversation, for them to be able to verbalize the things that the gender care clinic notes said that they were verbalizing, I just didn't feel like that. I didn't know how that was possible. So when I asked that question, they said, I want you to rest assured that they know what they're doing. Like they just silenced every concern that I had. Um, and another thought that like just really like upsets me is, so absolutely I want to keep kids safe. I want them to feel like I have no desire to do something for a child that's gonna end them up in the hospital with a suicide attempt or something. Like I want to keep kids safe. But my loyalty isn't just to the 13-year-old them. Like my loyalty is also to the them at 20, you know? And if they decide when they're 18 that Yeah, absolutely. I want to be a different gender. Like, okay, you've thought about that for a long time, and that is still something that you feel like is true for you. And that's a different conversation. But what if I sign off on something for a child and um 10 years down the road they think like, oh my gosh, I this isn't true for me. And then they think back to like me writing a letter to support them starting a testosterone or whatever. And they think, why didn't my therapist say anything? Why did they just smile at me and nod at me and act like I knew what I was talking about at 13 or 16? Like, how is that good care? I don't understand how that's good care. I don't want somebody to look back and think, man, I went to a therapist and they didn't do anything for me.
When you
Which a
presented,
lot of the detransitioners are saying, right, is they've lost trust for the therapist and the doctors.
Sure. Yeah, I think people are so worried about not, I don't know, about just it's like this woke mentality, right? Like, absolutely, if somebody, like, this is not an issue for me about whether or not people are allowed to be transgender. Absolutely, that is fine. But let's wait until you're not 13 when everything is confusing, you know? And I think people are so concerned about it's almost like becoming this political thing that has nothing to do with the client sitting in front of you at all, you know?
what was your sense from your colleagues who were the ones who were, blowing up the chat box, admonishing you for having concerns or for vocalizing your concerns? Because I can't imagine it's anything other than like a self-defense response on their part. Like, because, I mean, how do they not have similar concerns, right? But they like that's what I keep thinking is like, or also your boss, right? When you presented um, those findings to her, whatever it was that you wanted her to read to better understand your concerns, she said she didn't have time. Do you actually believe that she just was, so harried and didn't have time to read it, or was it a self-protective, like I can't absorb information that's going to give me, that kind of cognitive dissonance about what we're doing here?
Yeah, I think that probably is more like it. I think that if people listen to me, then um they have to consider the possibility that they have hurt kids, you know, or they have not always acted in their best interest. Um, and I think also you have to ask yourself if they were to listen to me, then that there's another level of this. Like, why are the higher ups at multicare mandating this thing that other people have concerns about? And then how do you stay at an organization that doesn't listen when you say, I don't know if this is best practice? So yeah, I think it was scary for people to think that that I knew what I was talking about in any small sense.
Yeah, and then even outside of the professional context, it's the cultural context. It's like having those concerns means you're far right, right? And so
Yeah,
there's like a whole identity crisis involved in really seeing the harm that's being done, I think.
yeah. And that's not what it is for me at all. Like, I just want to make sure that the kids that are in my care, that I'm doing what's best for them. And I know everyone has a different idea of what that looks like, but um, my understanding is that 85% of transgender youth who are allowed to progress through puberty normally outgrow that. They end up being gay or something else. Like, they're, if we just let them figure out who they are, then when they're 18, they might be like, I mean, I just feel like let's let kids be kids, you know, without making any permanent decisions when they're still learning.
It's definitely a red flag for me. To like, I've worked in a number of different areas of clinical practice, and so you kind of get used to the conventions of how different clinical things are discussed amongst clinicians. And yeah, there at times there are disagreements, and there are people that have strong personalities and strong opinions, but it's still considered acceptable, I would say, across the board, that you discuss research, you debate how you're interpreting that research, and that's how we develop good practice, right? Is through really working out those questions and backing up what we're saying with evidence. But it's quite different in this type of care, as you experience, that as soon as you ask a question that is a sound clinical question, it's like, yes, Europe is doing systematic reviews and is really revamping how they do this care. So that seems to me a very reasonable question is, okay, when they're doing that, why are we so confident with this? Like that, even if they disagreed with you, it's a reasonable question. So it is a red flag that it's not just you, but this seems to be a trend in this whole movement is any question or any pushback, they become very hostile.
Absolutely. Yeah, and at no point did anyone ever say, you know what, thank you for your questions. Let me know what article or what you were reading that made you draw that conclusion so that I can look that over and tell you why you're wrong. They never asked for any like anything. They just were so quick to dismiss everything I was saying and call me transphobic and other things that just like broke my heart.
Because I experienced something quite similar when I had, questions and concerns and differences of opinion is automatically the go-to is you're just bigoted and transphobic
Mhm.
and spreading propaganda. Like there's no conversation. Like if I was
Nope.
wrong, then explain why I was wrong, right? Like explain to me
Exactly.
why thinking has changed so much over the last several decades on this. And if you're so confident that what you're doing is right, you should be able to explain it and bring people along, into your
Absolutely.
thinking.
And not just bully them. I feel like once you are so defensive and so angry that you can't have a conversation anymore, something else is going on, you know?
Right. Yeah. It's time to take pause and reflect why you can't address, what the person is
Mhm.
saying without resorting to, yeah, verbal abuse and mind reading accusations, etc.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is just sound relational awareness, right? I mean, if you were in a one-to-one relationship with somebody that every time you disagreed or asked a question, they blew up at you and called you names, we would consider that an abusive relationship.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah,
yet
there
that's happening within a
Professionally.
system of care or professionally en
Mhm.
masse.
Yep, absolutely. I did say that at one point that I felt like I was almost in an abusive relationship with my employer because every time I tried to say something, they made me feel crazy. They made me feel like I hated transgender people. Like it was just, oh, it was just so awful.
So how's it been since the release of the article and you're coming forward?
Yeah, so I had somebody recently ask me how I'm handling all the negative things being said about me. I'm not looking at anything. I don't
Okay.
care to know what people have to say about me. Um, but 2 days ago, I ended up losing my new job. So I feel like there's definitely been fallout, you know. They didn't give that as the reason that I lost my job. They just said I wasn't the right fit for the role, but it's definitely turned my life upside down. There's been people who have um, expressed support, and then I got, uninvited to a coworker's kid's birthday party. Like it's just been a lot, you know.
Has anyone in your life expressed support for you?
Absolutely. The people who I am closest to, even if they don't necessarily 100% say like, yeah, I totally agree with you. They say, I am so proud of you for standing up for what you feel is right. You know, it takes courage to have a voice when you know that people are going to tear you apart for it.
I'm sorry for the fallout that you've received.
It's okay. I feel like um I told somebody yesterday, I'm scared and I'm sad and I'm angry, but I'm not sorry. Like I'm not sorry for having a voice. I feel like I owe it to the kids that I work with and their parents. I would be furious if I thought I was taking my gender dysphoric child to a therapist to get help and they were just rubber stamping anything that the kid said and, fast tracking them to medicalization.
I've worked in a number of different programs. I'll just give you an anecdote from the eating disorders program where I used to work. Because in our services, we provided a very structured environment on the inpatient unit in order to try to manage the behaviors and provide therapeutic support for them. And sometimes our clients, because we were a provincial program, so sometimes our clients would go to hospitals in their local area rather than travel several hours to come to our department, which is what they're supposed to do. You go to your local hospital first. And we would have hospitals give us a call and say, hey, I've got one of your patients here. We are going to admit them. We're going to, refeed them, get them to gain some weight. can you send us a care plan? And we would send a care plan that was based on our own care plan that was very highly structured. And sometimes the clinicians would say, well, we don't want to do that. That seems mean, that seems punitive, right? To not allow them to go out for passes in which they'll run around the block 3 times to try to lose weight. Like there's reasons why we had these protocols in place. So some of them would push back saying, well, no, I think having that kind of limits and structure isn't appropriate. And then they would inevitably give us a call again a month later saying, okay, what do we do? Our client hasn't gained any weight. We let them out on passes and they're running around to lose weight. And what do we do? And I said, well, you need to follow the care plan. But what a lot of the patients would say in those hospitals is, send me to St. Paul's. You guys don't know what you're doing. Because
Wow.
on one hand, I mean, yes, when we put limits on them, they would sometimes get angry and try to push against those limits. But I would say the vast majority of times, people know that they're safe within those limits. And when
Hmm.
you're a clinician who isn't willing to provide any limits for someone who doesn't have the internal structure to do that for themselves, they don't feel safe.
Yeah, absolutely. They say that with parenting too, right? Like kids feel safe when there's boundaries, when there's rules, when they know sort of like they feel like, okay, the adults around me know what they're doing. I am okay, versus being like, I don't know, we can just kind of do whatever you want.
So in the case of your client that identified as a wounded dog, to me that's a signal they're trying to express something to you, right?
Absolutely.
And
Hmm.
to feel like all of these adults are saying, yep, okay, you're a wounded dog, let's affirm that, and let's start you on hormones because you identify that way, isn't I wonder how safe that kid really feels in that
Sure,
process.
sure. I have that same concern. Um, and what if there was a part of them that was like, when I said that I identify as male, that didn't get the reaction I wanted. So now I'm going to say that I identify as wounded male dog as like a cry for help. But no one seems to care about that either?
Because no one's really listening to that cry for help.
Yeah. Hmm.
So it
Yeah.
sounds like a young person that's really struggling to express the level of distress and pain that they're in.
Yeah.
They can't find the words for it, and
Yeah.
they're channeling it through things like identify as a wounded dog, and no one's really hearing that, it sounds like.
Yeah. I That's probably how the kid would feel too?
It's obviously you care a lot about your clients.
I do. I care
Yeah.
very much. And that's again why it broke my heart that my colleagues just kind of turned on me. I care so much.
How large is the clinic, would you say? Like how many colleagues were there? You said
Oh
there was
yeah.
many people in that training anyway.
Yeah, multi-care is huge. I don't even know how many clinicians. There were 100 and there were 122 in that meeting, but my understanding is that that wasn't the only meeting that they had. So it's yeah, it's a huge population of clinicians and off many of the youth in Washington do go to multi-care. So I have huge concerns about what we're doing with the kids in the society.
Yeah, it was very, very little oversight, and well, in any of this, but especially in our state. Um,
I also
Yeah,
don't understand why, like, even if someone was started on hormones, why does the therapy have to stop at that point? Why couldn't you? So if they decided that hormones were the way to go and they started them on hormones, why couldn't you have continued to still explore those things with the client? I find that so puzzling, like why therapy
sure,
has to stop and as soon as the hormones start.
sure, or not necessarily even stop if it never began, but like um where you have to tiptoe around those questions, like whether or not they end up being starting some sort of hormone replacement therapy, like previously or after they start it, like you can't ask anything. You can't ask anything about, okay, so where is this coming from or anything about their past that they might interpret you trying to imply that their gender identity isn't 100% valid or whatever.
Because
Yeah.
I saw clients too in practice that had sexual abuse backgrounds, and absolutely would ask them about it, and I would frame that in a way that hopefully felt safe to them, and saying, this is something that I think is important to ask about. And they were always understanding of that. It's like, well, of course you need to ask about that. And the point wasn't to try to trick them, into
No.
saying something wrong. The point is, I wanted to understand their thought process, and to what degree had they already considered how is my gender identity related or not related to what happened to me. And I just wanted to see some evidence that they had thought that through in some sort of kind of logical way. And in some cases, I felt like they hadn't explored that very adequately. In other cases, I felt like they had, and they were able to say, yes, I thought about it, and this is my thought process, and this, I landed on, this decision, and I don't think it's related to this abuse because X, Y, and Z. Well, at least they've really demonstrated they've thought about it, right? They've pieced all that together, and they've thought it all through.
Yeah. So, I mean, I could definitely say, hey, tell me about your sexual abuse history and let's process some of that trauma. I couldn't say, do you feel like that has any impact on your gender identity presently? Like, I couldn't work through that with them in I couldn't be like, do you think there's anything about that that has led you to where you're at today? Or do you feel like, no, I felt this, like, this is, that is not part of the story or not part of the, what led me to this place in my life, Um, and the person who did the training said that there's no reason that somebody's gender identity would be mixed up in anything else. So like if they did have a traumatic background, like that's irrelevant. Like you don't ask those questions because they know who they are.
Yeah, I found it quite remarkable. They literally said that there's nothing that causes gender distress other than gender, or something
Yeah.
along those lines. Yeah,
What's
Yes.
gender? It's just gender.
Yeah. Oh, it's so confusing. I don't, yeah, breaks my heart.
And yet we do have detransitioners coming forward saying, well, it was because of my sexual abuse history. It was because of my internalized homophobia. Like there's people saying that these things did contribute to their decision to transition and how
Sure.
they were their own self-perception. So we
Yeah.
do
And then
have evidence.
absolutely. And then they have every right to look back and feel like the medical system failed them for not asking those questions.
So where do you go from here? What's next for you?
That is a very good question. I want to continue to have a voice where I'm able to because I have sacrificed so much time and tears and emotion. I want so desperately to see something change for these kids. Um, and maybe I'll start doing private practice or something because I know that there's a great need um, for people in this community, to have a therapist who's going to listen to them and sit with them and help them feel safe and not judged and not rush to medicalize them. I know that people feel safe with me because they've tried to follow me from multi-care to the place that I was at recently, and that just is so reassuring to me.
That's
I'm
good.
doing good work with these people, even if my colleagues would say otherwise.
sounds like it, definitely.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. And it sounds like a very stressful time for you, but I appreciate your
Yeah.
time just telling us the story.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for talking with me. And yeah, it's stressful, but I have hope. I have hope that something will eventually shift or that in some small way that I'm not necessarily seeing right now that I'm helping tip the needle in the right direction.
You definitely are, Opa. Definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.